Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar as we initiate a community-wide discussion on a Biological Collections Action Center. It's great to have you all with us. My name is Pam Soltis from IDIG Bio and the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'll be joined shortly by my colleagues, Andy Bentley and Barbara Thiers, who will offer their perspectives on an action center to help set the stage for our discussion. Next slide, please. But before we embark on our discussion, I'd like to make a few housekeeping and procedural announcements. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available online at the webinar series wiki page after the webinar. Also, please continue to use the chat feature to interact with panelists and attendees. It's great to be hearing greetings from so many of you, but please don't use it for asking questions later on during the discussion. Instead, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to type in your questions for the speakers. Alternatively, you can also use the raise hand feature on Zoom and we'll call on you to ask your question. We'd also like to make you all aware that we'll be using the discourse platform to capture questions and comments as well, and more on that later. And finally, we'll address the questions after all of our presentations. Next slide, please. Today's session is the first of 3 webinars on the topic of a Biological Collections Action Center. We will meet again the following 2 Tuesdays, March 14th and 21st, also at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. In those webinars, you'll hear some additional voices on what an action center could or perhaps should be. Next. So what is the Biological Collections Action Center and what has prompted this series of discussions? Well, the term Action Center for Biological Collections was introduced in 2020 in the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASEM, consensus study report entitled Biological Collections: Ensuring Critical Research and Education for the 21st Century. Now, although introduced in the NASEM report, the concept of a coordinating body for biological collections was actually presented by the Biological Collections Network, or BCON, in its report, The Extended Specimen Network, published in 2019. So this is a concept that has been building in the collections community for several years. Next. Our current launch of a community dialogue on a Biological Collections Action Center was prompted by passage last summer of the bipartisan U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, which President Biden signed into law on August 9th. Now, included in this $280 billion package is verbal support for biological collections through an action center. However, funds have not been appropriated for the center, and the nature of the center has not been determined. Let me repeat that. Funds have not been appropriated for the center, and the nature of the center has not been determined. The ongoing series of discussions that we're launching today will help collect community input on what such a center might entail. Again, no funds have been appropriated, no description has been written, no plans have been made. Our purpose over the next few weeks and through subsequent workshops and focus groups is to gather community input. To that end, IDIG Bio has also launched a community discussion using the discourse platform, and we invite you to use this platform to share your thoughts and reactions in the coming weeks and even months. And a final note, the U.S. CHIPS and Science Act is aimed at STEM infrastructure and workforce training in the U.S., so some of the discussion will necessarily focus on the U.S. However, we welcome perspectives from the international community as well, particularly as the collections community continues to push new frontiers in international collaboration. Next. So let's return to the NASEM report and what it says about an action center. In this 244-page report, the action center is first mentioned on page 15 in the summary and is further developed in chapter 8, entitled Taking Collaborative Action. As the report states, although the biological collections community is motivated and active, Many of the community's endeavors to communicate the role of collections and position them and their associated metadata as critical infrastructure for addressing societal problems are disconnected and uncoordinated. A collaborative action center would facilitate and connect all relevant and interested parties, including living and natural history collections, leadership, curators and managers, university administrators, public and private funders, and the scientific communities that use collections, among other entities whose perspectives and needs are important to the future vitality of biological collections. Currently, there are no shared mechanisms, meeting spaces, or virtual platforms that bring together all of these relevant and interested parties. Next, please. Now, within the NASEM report, each chapter provides a set of recommendations. And in Chapter 8, the first recommendation is as follows. The National Science Foundation, in collaboration with other institutions that provide funding and other types of support for biological collections, should help establish a permanent National Action Center for Biological Collections to coordinate action and knowledge, resources, and data sharing among the nation's biological collections as they strive to meet the complex and often unpredictable needs of science and society. Such an action center should include a physical space and cyber infrastructure to develop and implement collaborative strategic efforts and further build and nurture communities of practice for research, education, workforce training, evaluation, and business model development, among other community-wide needs. Now, this is a lot of text, so let's unpack this text a little and focus on what I think are some of the key phrases in both the preamble to the recommendation and in the recommendation itself. Perhaps these phrases can help guide our discussion later in our session. So first of all, from the preamble, I think some of the key points are as listed here on the slide. The collections community is motivated and active. I think this is a true statement, but many community endeavors are disconnected and uncoordinated. Of course, the community has become more coordinated over the past decade or so, but there are certainly aspects where there could be improvement. The report refers to a collaborative action center, and I think collaboration here is a key point. It is recommended that it facilitate and connect stakeholders, and it points out that there are no shared mechanisms, meeting spaces, or virtual platforms that can adequately connect all of the potential stakeholders. Next slide, please. And from the first recommendation, this calls for the National Science Foundation, but not necessarily NSF it's alone, in collaboration with other institutions that provide funding and other types of support for biological collections. And we think this is an important point. It also calls for a permanent National Action Center so that there would not be the issue of periods of funding followed by uncertainty, followed by perhaps more funding and more uncertainty. Again, the concept of coordinating and collaborating comes through, coordinating action, knowledge, resources, and data sharing. In the report, it recommends physical space and cyber infrastructure as key resources. These are things we might return to a little bit later in today's session for discussion. And then develop and implement collaborative strategic efforts. Again, the emphasis on collaboration, and also nurturing communities of practice. Now, I'll return to these key phrases shortly. Now, one thing with regard to the committee is that the committee deliberately stopped short of prescribing a more detailed vision for the center. And our webinar series will start to make the vision more concrete and ultimately, we hope, turn it into reality. So today we'll hear perspectives from 3 of the NASEM committee members, myself, Andy Bentley, and Barbara Thiers. And incidentally, Andy and Barbara were also architects of the Beacon Extended Specimen Network report, which sort of presaged the suggestion of a community action center or coordinating unit, as they called it there. So we'll keep our comments very general and we will avoid considering details. Again, the speakers represent a set of US perspectives, given that our discussions are in response to a US law. But again, we welcome discourse with the international community. So next slide, please. So I'll begin our perspectives by sharing a few comments about my own vision of what an action center might be. Next. Now, for the past decade plus, I've had the privilege of serving the community through IDIG Bio. And thanks to literally hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, across the country and around the world, the community has made tremendous progress and innovation in digitization, data use, both for research and education and collaboration. Next. But there is so much more to do, and that requires a permanent center that can focus further on innovations in digitization, curation, cyber infrastructure, ongoing collecting, research, training, workforce development, globalization, and more. Moreover, we need to do this all in an equitable manner that celebrates human and biological diversity with respect for the lands from which the world's collections have been assembled, all those who contributed to these resources, and those who were exploited in the process. And in all of these endeavors, the center would be a clearinghouse for community best practices. Next, please. I'll return now to the key phrases that I parsed from the NASEM report text. These are the words that struck me most deeply and that I would hope would be captured in a vision of the Action Center: collaborative, connected, permanent, coordinator, facilitator, developer, and innovator. In addition, this would be a large endeavor. It would involve support from NSF and other partners. It most likely would involve physical space, connections that are linked by cyber infrastructure, and with an emphasis on equity, diversity, and inclusion, all ultimately resulting in best practices that can be shared with the community. So how do we design an action center that does all of this and more? Next, please. So at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleagues. Now, although all of the authors of the report contributed to discussions and writing and ultimately approved the entire report, each author likely has slightly different perspectives on the Action Center. And we expect that some themes will hit a chord with all of us, whereas others might be unique to one or a few authors. So I invite you to consider how our visions are similar and how they're different. So next up is Andy Bentley from the Biodiversity Center at the University of Kansas. Andy, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Pam. Hi, everybody. So I think that the idea of a biological collections action center holds a lot of promise on a number of fronts. In general terms, I think such a center could act as a hub for collaboration and coordination, as well as a clearinghouse for a number of important national and international initiatives. It could also serve to align a number of individual projects and initiatives that are already actively engaged in this sphere. Looking at more specifics, I think there are a number of key areas that such an action center could either assist in coordinating, aligning, promoting, or funding for long-term sustainability of collections infrastructure. So the first one of these is obviously digitization. We've made great strides in digitization in the biological collections community, but there is still a lot of work to be done. A lot of that work has been done through the yeoman's work, as Pam mentioned, of IDIG Bio, not only in terms of the digitization itself, but all of the ancillary pieces that are around that, the training, the workshops, all of the things that IDIG Bio has been feeding into the community in order to get this digitization going. So I think that an action center could provide some continuous funding for this and a home for this digitization initiative that we have ongoing, to coordinate the ADBC, TCN, and PEN process, to provide the infrastructure for the specimen data portal that currently is part of IDIG Bio, and also to coordinate the training and the workshops that are already ongoing. The other area is policy visioning and leadership. I think a number of the initiatives that Beacon and a number of other people have been doing in terms of policy and visioning for the biological collections community could be better coordinated and could be run by something like this in terms of an action center. The other one is obviously realizing the dream of the digital extended specimen. The digital extended specimen is something that is being promoted a lot in the biological collections community currently in terms of trying to integrate all of the data around a physical specimen to provide as much information about that specimen to promote research and education using biological specimens. So I think a data center could act to coordinate, develop, and engage the community, which is something that is going to be extremely important in order for us to realize this dream, but also provide the necessary cyber infrastructure that we need in order to be able to put this plan together. A digital repository that would house all of the digital information, a collections registry that would enumerate all of the individual collections that are part of the process, and also provide us with some attribution and advocacy metrics that we could use for our collections to be able to promote not only the collections, but the specimens that are housed within those collections. One of the other things that I think an action center could potentially do is act as a clearinghouse for things like best practices and standards that are being developed across our community through Spinach and various other organizations, but also policy, things like the Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing and permitting. Those kinds of things could all be coordinated through an action center and be the sort of US hub for our ABS efforts. One of the other things that I think is involved here is a national orphan collection discovery and clearinghouse. A number of collections are becoming orphaned. There are these dark collections that sit in people's laboratories and never make it into a repository, something that was mentioned in the Specimen Management Plan webinar series that we held recently. And I think some coordination around where best these orphan collections could end up, who could take them on, and how we could best, on a community level, start looking at supporting these kinds of collections. Obviously, there is a huge personnel and workforce component to this as well, in terms of supporting training, professional development, and workshops around the personnel and workforce who are going to be doing all of this work in terms of getting collections up and running. There is also a community engagement part of this as well. Not only engaging our own community and coordinating our own biological collections community, but also reaching out to communities like the zoo and aquarium community, the living collections community, the research community, as well as societies and international communities who are engaged in similar kinds of activities. There is also a lot of promotion of this idea of synthesis and data centers through NSF, and a lot of organizations have been funded for these synthesis and data centers that are mainly research coordination centers. And I think there is some efforts that could be done there in terms of promoting biological collections in those synthesis and data centers, and promoting the collaboration and coordination across all of these entities, and bringing them all together to then promote further collaboration and coordination. So with that, I'll hand over to Pam to introduce Barbara.
Great, thanks a lot, Andy. So our next presenter is Barbara Thiers, Director Emerita of the New York Botanical Garden Herbarium and Research Adjunct at the Denver Botanic Garden. Barbara, please go ahead.
Thanks, Pam. Since the U.S. Collection Digitization Initiative began in 2010, there's been widespread agreement that in order to maximize the value of our collections, we need to extend their use or the use of their derivative data to a wider audience. In the NEBA strategic plan that led to the establishment of the ADBC program, use cases for collections data were articulated for endeavors from agriculture to education, to national security, to public health and tourism. Broadening the use of collections data to serve such audiences must be a key objective of a National Biological Collections Action Center. During the past decade or so, we've seen the rise of a range of other environmental data initiatives, both national and international. Andy alluded to some of these. Representing all U.S. biological collections, the Action Center could lead the effort to ensure that collections data are integrated with these other environmental data sources and are completely compatible with them. Such work could involve compiling nationwide collections metadata to help potential partners understand the scope and breadth of data associated with our specimens, and the center could bring together potential data users with collection stewards to foster collaborations. Inherent interest in the organisms represented in biological collections creates the opportunity for the development of formal and informal educational initiatives to increase environmental awareness and biodiversity literacy. Given the imperative for citizens to understand the implications of climate change and modify their behavior accordingly, Biological Collections Action Centers should lead the development of collections-based environmental education initiatives that draw from the broad wealth of our national holdings. Next slide, please. There have been significant efforts in all of these areas over the past decade. We've seen increased use of biological collections data in biological research. Articles such as this overview by Mason Heberling and Alan Pather on the uses of herbarium specimen data demonstrate clearly that the greater availability of collections data has increased the usage of such data for understanding plant and fungal diversity. I'm sure it's true in all areas of natural history collections. The Biodiversity Collections Network, or BCON, has been holding regular meetings over Zoom for the past several years with representatives of other international collections data networks to ensure that our national data network will be compatible with all of those. And some of the partners in this effort are indicated here. BCON has also applied for funding to create a forum for discussing the interoperability of biodiversity data with other environmental data initiatives. And finally, there have been some brilliant educational initiatives that use specimens and derived data to increase biodiversity and data literacy, such as BLUE and BCENet. A biological collections center could amplify, support, and build on such initiatives and reach out to the broader circle of stakeholders that was identified more than a decade ago to ensure the continued support of individual collections institutions and maximize the value of the data they hold to address environmental challenges. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you, Barbara. And Jill, could you please stop sharing and we'll go ahead and get our discussion started. Great, thanks. So we've already got a couple of questions coming in. I'll just invite you again to put your questions in the Q&A, or alternatively, you can raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you to ask your questions out loud. And remember that we'll not be monitoring the chat or discourse for questions at this time, although you're welcome to share your thoughts with us and the rest of the community via discourse at any time. And we ask that you keep your questions and comments to concepts and generalities rather than details, because of course, no details have been worked out. That's the purpose of our meetings and discussions over the next few months. So, we have one question that was asked previously that Andy has already answered, so I'll just call everyone's attention to that. That's already in the Q&A. But we have an open question from Dan Distal. Would a permanent National Action Center require an act of Congress, and would that be likely to ever happen? Would anybody like to take a stab at that one? Andy or Barbara or anyone else who's participating?
I think the short answer is I don't know.
I have no idea.
I don't know what the procedure is. I mean, it is specifically called out in the CHIPS bill, so I don't know whether there would need to be an act of Congress to actually decide, you know, at what level it's going to be funded or what the appropriation is for that. I don't know what the specifics are, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not sure we know of an exactly comparable model to what we're talking about. And I think that's one reason why we need this intensive period of discussion, because I think we are producing something or conceiving of something that maybe doesn't already exist. So, yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks. I don't have anything to add to that either. Our next question from Keegan: do you envision this action center being a federal institution or created with federal dollars but managed privately? I think there's a lot of discussion already going on about what an action center might entail and how it might be managed. So I think there might be a lot of potential options here. One possibility is that there could be a single center associated with a current institution. Another option might be that the center would be distributed with different areas of expertise being provided by different centers or institutes around the country. There are probably many different ways that this could be implemented. And I'm not certain, based on the information we have, whether this would be viewed as a federal institution or something that would be managed as part of another institution. I think based on other centers that NSF has sponsored, my impression would be that there would be a call for proposals and it would go somewhere after that process. But I don't have any additional information on that. I don't know if anyone else here, if anyone who might be on from NSF might like to address that question.
I can only guess that from a sustainability point of view, the ideal model would be maybe some federal money, but finding a way to sustain the, sources of income that would sustain the center going forward. Because we know national funding or federal funding doesn't last forever. We have these series of, 10-year projects. But if you look at a place like NC's out in Santa Barbara, they were able to take that, follow up that 10 years with a model that brings in income and keeps them sustained. So it's probably not easy to do, but it's also not impossible.
Mhm.
Thanks. And actually, Andrea Weeks has a related question about what permanent national centers might serve as models for this, suggesting perhaps GenBank. And that, of course, is one of the options that we have discussed just informally among ourselves as well, something that everyone relies on, we can't do without, and, presumably is as permanent as anything could be. And that, I guess, would be an amazing, if we could achieve something like that, that would be amazing. I don't know if Andy or Barbara or anyone else from our audience would like to comment further, or if Andrea, if you have anything else you'd like to comment about that.
I think GenBank is a great example. It is a limited example in terms of it is just a data repository. I think what we're talking about here is a lot more extensive than that. But I think certainly it is a model that we can look at certainly for the data component, for sure. I think the whole idea of a data center is an interesting one, as to whether we're talking here about a bricks and mortar building or whether we're talking about something virtual, or some combination thereof, whether there's a bricks and mortar building that acts as the center that we can sort of point at and say, look at the top of the hill. That's our infrastructure. That's what we use to support biological collections, much like the astronomers do in pointing at their telescope. But also having some virtual component that then feeds into that, I think would probably be a good model to look at.
Thanks. So Rebecca Snyder has a question, and in that question, she calls out Barbara's comments. So maybe, Barbara, this one can go to you. I can read this so that everyone can see what the question is about. And in the meantime, Barbara, you can maybe think about how you might want to reply. So Rebecca writes, the stated and proposed outstanding needs that would be coordinated by a national action center exist within the whole of the natural history community, from bio to paleo to MINC to anthropology collections. Barbara mentioned the value of interfacing with environmental data as part of the extended specimen concept. Would adding the whole of natural history be an option to the purview, or would the center need to coordinate with a yet created proposed equivalent action center?
Well, I mean, I would hope that this would be the purview of the center. And I think in terms of what I was talking about specifically was data interoperability. And yes, for the extended specimen concept specifically, but I think that we do have a strong commitment to making our data completely interoperable with all other data resources. And that's been a major topic of discussion, as I say, over the past few years in the international group that meets. So I don't like, it makes my head spin to think of yet another center beyond this one that we're talking about. So I would hope that that is exactly the purview of this center. And also broadening it, to include, I think as Andy mentioned, microbial data, data from culture collections, as well as zoos, botanical gardens, seed banks, germplasm repositories. So we're thinking collections very broadly going forward.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Deb Paul. And she writes, are folks here knowledgeable about SYSYNC, an NSF funded center? While it's not an action center on the scale we're talking about, it might be a model to look at for spanning boundaries, which is what we seem to be saying we want. So yeah, great point, Deb. SYSYNC has really spanned a number of boundaries, crossing various aspects associated with the environment. And so I think that's another great option. And if you want to add anything to that, Deb, please feel free. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Okay. Yorit writes, in my experience, collaborative efforts go beyond borders. How would you balance your US focused center with this borderless challenge we are trying to address? Maybe I'll take a quick stab at a few comments with this, and then I'll turn things over to Andy and Barbara to add more. And if other panelists who will be presenting in future weeks or other members of the audience would like to contribute to this, please feel free as well. So there are many current efforts to internationalize the efforts that are funded from the US. So for example, US is a major contributor to GBIF. And so right off the bat, we are using US funds toward global goals. There's also a strong international group that's in part organized and led by IDIG-Bio. Beacon is also participating and leading some of these globalization efforts. Certainly any sort of data sharing has to take into account what's happening in other countries. And so I would anticipate that the international component would have to be very strong for any particular proposal to be funded in the future. Andy and Barbara or anyone else, if you'd like to contribute to that, please do. And Deb, we'll get to you in just a sec.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's a number of obvious corollaries with what's going on with DISCO over in Europe. And so, there's obvious ways in which we can collaborate, and I see this action center functioning very much like a US-centric DISCO. And so there's obvious ways in which we can collaborate with DISCO and try and form an international, perspective to this rather than it just being a US-centric one, for sure.
Also, I'd be disappointed if one of the roles, maybe not immediately, because we have to figure out how to do this here first, based on learning from DISCO and ALA and other initiatives. But I would be disappointed if we couldn't play a supporting role in helping other countries to develop, action centers so that to mobilize their data, because each place that does this, there are lessons to be learned and ways to facilitate the next one. So maybe not the first thing we would do as an action center, but certainly something that we should do.
Great, thanks to both of you. Deb, would you like to make a comment here, either in response to your previous question or in response to this one, either one?
Yeah, I think you guys, many of you know me well enough. I would say +1 to the borderless concept. I mean, we don't want to be in the way of other people making progress, nor do we want to get in our own way of learning from what others are doing. So making sure when we set up things that we think carefully about not putting borders in the way of being able to do that. And one example here, Barb, you might right away is like the Slack that you set up during COVID. How could you immediately stay in touch with all this disparate group of people who are all around the planet? And Spinach now does the same thing, for example. And so that expertise isn't constrained by a national border.
Right.
Great, thank you. Our next question has to do with AI. And this is from Dan Distal again. With increasing AI capabilities, it is becoming easier to acquire information from multiple sources. Should an action center aim to take advantage of these capabilities rather than trying to create one central solution for all collections? Andy, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's what I was talking about in terms of having a central hub, but also having all of these sort of virtual hubs that feed into that. I don't think there is any need or any want to accumulate all of that information in a single place. I think with the extended specimen network and the infrastructure that we're going to put in place in order to be able to link all these collections and pieces together, I think that will do an effective job of linking all of that stuff together. I think it's all of the ancillary stuff around that I think could benefit from having a central hub that would coordinate and direct all of those efforts.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
agree. I mean,
And sorry.
I was going to say AI.
Sorry, Barb, go ahead.
No, we've hardly even begun to scratch the surface of what AI might help us do in terms of making data compatible, completing data. We have an awful lot of incomplete data from specimens, and some of the challenges of the extension of specimens through data linkage may well be solved by AI. So again, I think AI would be an important component of this on the technical side. The technical team would certainly be employing AI from the outset, I would hope.
And someone who might be able to share a little bit about a vision for AI is Arthur Porto. So Arthur, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think one thing that is worth keeping in mind is that the challenges for AI tends to facilitate things, but it also doesn't necessarily mean it won't have its challenges. So I think having different standards and different collections, you can do something in terms of integrating that, but it won't be kind of a thing that will solve all the problems. There's no magical solution that will just make everything integrate perfectly. So I think it's good still to have some kind of central, or at least like something to aim to, that then perhaps will facilitate some of that integration of those different data sources. But yeah, I'm not sure I actually answered the question, but it was just my experience with AI is that it is not really this kind of magical solution to everything in many ways.
Thanks for your perspective. That's really helpful. Because I think the rest of us think it is going to be the solution to everything. So, so thanks. So we have a comment from Garth Holman. The EU synthesis project may be a comparable model. So thanks for sharing that with us. That's a really good suggestion. The next comment we have is from Brian McLean. Could a center take on a role of meeting global biodiversity compacts and agreements, for example, by provisioning necessary data products and ensuring quality interoperability? This may move the funding model beyond just the purview of NSF. I think that's a really good suggestion. One of the things that we did discuss in the context of developing the NASEM report was the fact that there are many other federal agencies and other organizations that also rely on information taken from natural history collections. And yet it is almost exclusively NSF that funds the support of these collections at the federal level. And so if it would be possible for NSF to develop other partnerships to increase the scope of funding and the amount of funding, I think that could be extremely beneficial. And Barbara or Andy, I don't know if either of you would like to comment on that further.
Totally agree. Yep.
So Prasanta raises an interesting point. Why not an international center, something across multiple governments that would be more collaborative and less centralized?
I mean, the simple answer is that this, we have been talking about a national plan, imagining national funding, and this came up in the CHIPS Act, which was nationally directed. So that's why. And also when the US calls something international, is that not seeming a little presumptuous when there are all these other efforts going on? So maybe, maybe some term that's neither of those is the best. It's neither national nor international.
I think an international center like that would be difficult to fund. I think obtaining funding from multiple different governments to fund something like that would be a challenge. And I think what we really need to do is focus on a US-centric model for now, and then coordinate that model with existing models that are out there for other countries to form an international center, a virtual international center of our efforts, DISCO's efforts, ALA's efforts, GBIF's efforts, all of those, individual entities, to then put together a sort of, international center that is in virtual space. But I think first we need to have a sort of US-centric center that can feed into that.
Yeah, and Scott Miller raises the point in the chat that, in fact, to the extent that it does some components of things that we're talking about, GBIF is such an international center, but it is unique in the fact that it receives funding from so many contributing organizations. But I guess that says that it is possible to achieve something like that. So thanks for raising that question, Prasanta. Austin Mast, given that so much of our biodiversity occurrence records are now arising from observations via iNaturalist, for example, would there be benefits to thinking about folding that as a major source of data opportunities into a scope of a biodiversity action center?
Yeah.
Who would like to comment on that?
Yes. I think part of the extended specimen network plan is that it would include observation data as well as occurrence records from biological collections. We realize that observation data is now becoming such a huge part of the data landscape that we are looking at in terms of, answering bigger questions like global climate change and spread of disease and those kinds of things. That it's a necessary part of what the digital extended specimen plan would entail, and the hope is that this action center would support that digital infrastructure necessary for that extended specimen network to work, and would by necessity include observation records. Yeah.
Great.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Austin. Of course, the concept of the Action Center grew out of the discussion about living in natural history collections. And so it was very much specimen and collection focused. But as things evolve, including various observational data and providing opportunities for assessing the ability of those data to serve the same purposes that our specimens do, I think that could be a really valuable contribution as well. We have a comment from Rebecca Snyder. More a comment, very excited about the potential for this action center to facilitate our collective efforts to make our data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so thanks very much. We agree completely. This, of course, has been one of the goals through the various digitization efforts and other community efforts that have been established and have taken off over the last several years, but certainly we are not at that point yet. So that's a really good comment to make. Thank you. Hillary Swain. Oops, I just lost that one. The name Action Center implies collections data and analyses will drive impacts through science. Although Barbara read a good list, agriculture, education, environment, health, national security, etc. In viewing the slides and words seemed very focused on building science and impacts, and this seemed implicit, not explicit. Maybe would benefit to address enhanced impact. So thanks a lot, Hillary, for raising that point. Yeah, Barbara or Andy, either of you want to comment on that further?
Well, sort of implied in what I was saying is that, you know, we've achieved a lot in the last decade, but we didn't really achieve that. We didn't achieve the broadening that we intended. Now, I think it's fair to say we had enough on our plate getting collections digitized as much as we did, but we probably don't have too many examples because we haven't really done it yet. You know, we made some attempts, they're little inroads. We certainly have a broader audience than we did, but we're a long way from sort of the things we talked about at the beginning, like, you know, all sorts of things that would be available to anybody about what collections were made in a given area that you are, in a national park, or flying over, you know, flying in the airplane. There's a million ideas that are very fun to think about, but it's that initial approach and engagement, which has proved really hard once we step out of the scientific realm. And that's where I think a huge amount of creativity is going to be needed to, and some help in making the kind of context that will lead to this really impactful broadening that we need to do.
Thanks. Andy, anything to add?
Nope, totally agree.
Great, thanks. So here's a question for Andy. Could you speak more to a national orphans collection discovery and clearinghouse? Who would do the work of cataloging large tissue collections from the small institutions and field research stations with tissues that need to be accessioned into a national collection? Would they provide funding for samples to be QR coded, organized, stored, et cetera, by the institution, and work with them to import that data? Is this somewhat like what Specify software can do?
There's a lot to unpack there. So starting out with the National Orphan Collection Discovery and Clearinghouse, what I was thinking of there, so Spinach has been toying with this for some time now. You know, taking on these orphan collections is currently a very uncoordinated process. It's literally somebody saying, sure, I can take that collection into my collection. And it puts pressure on a collection in terms of space and resources in order to take those orphan collections on board. And so Spinach was toying with the idea of a sort of centralized place where you could publish an orphan collection and say, you know, we have this orphan collection that's available for somebody to take on. And there could be a more sort of community-based solution to taking that collection on by looking for the best collection who could take that collection on, you know, in terms of what collection does the material fit best with, who has the resources to take it on, rather than it being a sort of very slapdash email-based exchange of, yeah, we can take this collection on or whatever. And I think that's something that needs a lot of coordination and a lot of effort in terms of doing that kind of thing. In terms of who's going to do the actual work, that's part of the process that we brought up in the Specimen Management Plan webinars that we held recently. There is a program through NSF to fund taking on orphan collections, so there is some money available there. But the Specimen Management Plan would more formally put in place some funding mechanisms for people who are doing specimen-based research and have these collections in their labs that have been funded through NSF money that need to be put into a collection. The Specimen Management Plan would put in place some idea of the funding levels that would be necessary in order to be able to fund the cataloging and the digitization of those specimens in order for another collection to be able to take them on. And obviously, any CMS software collection management system has a role to play there in terms of being able to digitize those effectively and publish them to the outside world. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks. And there are some comments going on in the chat with regard to this topic. For example, having a sort of dating service that would allow for matchmaking between those with collections and those wanting to accession them. Deb, go ahead.
I wanted to add, while we were talking about that, I suspect many of us think about the specimens. When we talk about orphan collections, we're thinking about shelf space and the kind of things Andy alluded to with who's the best suited to hold those types of objects or that particular group of organisms. Please think also about the data. They may have data, and handling that and taking it over, and transforming it into whatever format you need it in to take care of it inside your collection management software or your database also takes a great deal of time, expertise, and money.
Yep.
And so it's not just about the physical objects, and you need the data, right, in order to get the use out of those objects. So please put that in the dating service.
Totally agree. And, you know, part of the specimen management plan would essentially force a collaborative discussion between the researcher and the collection that they're looking at lodging the stuff with, to ensure that the data is a format that is easily transferable into the CMS, you know, either through some sort of workbench or whatever, to be able to effectively digitize that material and not add to the backlog that we already have, for sure.
Thanks. Daniel Glusenkamp notes that California has funded collection rescue, and folks can now get rapid grants for saving a collection. And he gives the an address there for that. So that's also a great model. Let's see, we're starting to wind down in time. We have time for a few more questions, and we've got several here already going. Aaron Robinson says, I wonder how iSample's infrastructure and the companion Sampling Nature Research Coordination Network might be part of this planning process too. I think that's a really good suggestion. We've just started the conversation, and this is a great time to think about making sure that we engage all potential partners in the conversation. So thanks very much for sharing that, Aaron. Barbara,
and just quickly, iSamples is part of the international group that we have been meeting with. So Beacon and IDIC Bio and GBIF and ALA and iSamples and DISCO and various other people are meeting collaboratively to talk about international ways in which we can foster this collaboration and ensure that we're all sort of directed at the same thing and moving in the same direction.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Cody Thompson. The natural history community has worked historically with limited budgets and underpaid curatorial staff working for the greater good. How might a center such as this help move the needle on workforce development in our community, ensuring that museum careers in whatever capacity are available to all? It's a really great question. I think we all envision that workforce training and development would be a large component of this action center, but making sure that there is support for careers in this field will be crucial for the success of that. And so there would be, I think, need for that sort of information to be passed on. We do envision, based on the report itself, that there would be opportunities for reaching out and dialogue with university administrators, with collections leadership, and so on. And so this could be an opportunity for us to help ensure that collections provide, well-paying positions for the people who are doing the curation of the specimens, the curation of the data, and all of the other things that are involved there. Barbara or Andy, anything to add?
No, but just related. I mean, I think we've imagined in the thinking very broadly that the center might offer some courses that people could take and become increasingly certified in different techniques, which would be a great way to demonstrate the need for higher pay or to help with a better job, if you can't get the higher pay. So yeah, I think empowering the workforce is a key, and professionalizing the workforce is key to the success.
Yeah, I think professional development and advocacy are two big areas that I think the Action Center could play a role. both in terms of advocating for the career of collection management, but also providing those professional development opportunities like Barbara mentions of, being able to provide those opportunities for people to improve their skills, particularly on the data front. There's a lot of us that are not as data savvy as some other people, so providing those opportunities for people to be able to take those professional development opportunities and advance themselves. As well as engaging, students, museum studies degrees, those kinds of things to bring in the next generation and ensure that we are, building a platform for the next generation to move in and take over from, us old fogies.
So maybe we'll just take one more comment here, and then I'll do a formal wrap up because we do have a survey that we would like people to take, and we would also, I also want to be respectful of everyone's time. But there are several additional questions here in the Q&A, and I'm not sure about Barbara and Andy's availability, but I'd be willing to stay on for a few more minutes to continue the discussion after we do our final wrap up. So I just do want to make this comment that that Dan raised. My reasoning for mentioning AI was not to imply a magic solution, but rather to point out that AI is changing the way people search for data, and centralized one-stop shopping databases may not be the future of data distribution. So very, very important point. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so let's see. So that concludes our discussion for today. We hope you'll join us again next week for webinar 2 in our series, when we'll hear from 4 more members of the NASEM Report Committee: Joe Cook, Scott Edwards, Talia Kareem, and Shirley Pomponi. The following week, we're pleased to welcome members of the Federal Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections, as well as representatives of other stakeholder groups, such as the American Institute of Biological Sciences and Beacon. And these include Scott Miller, Kevin Hackett, Diane DeUlias, Jyotsna Pandey, and Brita Zimkus. And next slide, please. Final slide. And finally, thanks so much to Andy and Barbara for sharing their thoughts today. Also, many thanks to Jill Goodwin, Gil Nelson, Lauren Cohen, and Jesse Grasso behind the scenes for making sure that everything ran smoothly. And thanks so much to all of you for your participation. And we would just ask that you please complete the survey available in the QR code on your screens or in the chat. And thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Or we'll hang on for a few more minutes if people would like to continue the discussion. Looks like a number of people are still staying on, so maybe we'll just go ahead with a few more comments and questions. But let's not add any more. We will just stop it right with the last one being Dan's last comment. Okay, so let's see. Yoran says, currently the U.S. has a vibrant community of collection management systems and specialist collections groups. Noting that smaller collection communities may have less time or resources to attend meetings to have their voices heard and inputs considered, can you elaborate a little on how you're planning to keep these productive groups and their knowledge intact while also layering the beneficial sauce of a collection action center on top? Yeah, lots of great points in that comment, Yurit. I think one of the things that will be particularly important is that we do try to accommodate the schedules and resources of the entire collections community and various other stakeholders so that we can capture as much of what will be important to these different communities as possible. And for this reason, we are starting out with this webinar series to raise awareness about this. We're going to be having focus groups. There are workshops. There is the discourse option for just providing some comments and questions online when one has a chance to think about this. And we'd be happy to welcome various other approaches to gathering input from the various communities that the Action Center would be serving. And Andy and Barbara, any further comments on that?
No, except that I guess one worry, or what used to be a worry when someone proposed a center, is that this somehow takes agency away from other institutions, or it tries to impose a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that one of the things that will have to be done at every single step, and probably many times over, is to assure that this is meant to enable and help and not to dictate or control. And that's going to involve continually being called out, I'm sure, which maybe happens through a series of advisory groups, or some kind of oversight that makes sure that the Action Center stays in its track and does what it can nationally without interfering with individual institutions or not ignoring other institutions.
Totally agree. Yep. I think our community has done relatively well in the past in working on a sort of bottom-up kind of approach, and ensuring
Thanks.
that, you know, the voices of all of these
go
individual
ahead.
people are still, you know, being heard. But it is something that we definitely need to focus on. Looks like Pam is frozen.
I think we may have lost Pam. Is this,
Yeah.
thank you everyone for joining. Is this seems like a good place to stop? Is that okay? Or did you all want to continue with?
I'm happy to stay on and answer some more questions if there are any. But
It's a particularly interesting question posed by Jonathan Blythe that it would probably be good to discuss. He says, I'm interested in the legal framework needed to make an action center work. As soon as you assign interpretive methods to collections, there are ownership issues and maybe even repatriation issues if collections were unjustly acquired from indigenous or other natures. Have you thought of a framework, a rights framework for the action center? And I mean, no, we haven't, because there isn't even a center or even a plan for one, but I certainly agree that is an issue that has to be part of everything we discuss.
And there is a lot of talk of those kinds of things in our community currently: repatriation, you know, access and benefit sharing, data rights, you know, licensing, copyright. All of those kinds of things are definitely topics that are starting to bubble up to the surface and are being discussed a lot more. And those are certainly things that would be part of an action center. You know, being the US hub for an ABS clearinghouse, for instance, would go a long way to ensuring that we are, you know, abiding by all of those principles that are laid out in the Nagoya Protocol.
Looks like.
Thanks. So I'm in a hotel in Brussels at the moment, and my Wi-Fi just cut out a minute ago, and it may happen again. So so hopefully I'm back live. Let's see. So I think is Kevin's comment up next, or question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so is there an economy of scale, actions that could be taken by the action center that would not occur without an action center, even if existing centers were given additional resources? It's a really interesting thing to think about. And because I'm probably going to cut out again, I'll let somebody else answer.
Well, there better be, because that would be the argument for funding, right? I mean, that's why we've been saying all along we need this. And so that articulating the answer to that question, I think, is probably central to the success of the whole endeavor.
Yeah, and as I think I mentioned in writing to Kevin's question, you know, there are certainly economies of scale in terms of bargaining power that we have for data infrastructure, for things like, you know, data storage and all of those kinds of things. There's certainly collective bargaining that we can go into in terms of pricing for cloud storage and things like that would be of huge benefit to the community. You know, currently all of the data storage associated with collections and this mountain of digital data that we're creating around our collections is all left to the individual institutions, and there is no sort of community solution to this. things like Data One and those kinds of things get at part of that question. And I think having an action center that could coordinate all of those efforts and bring about collective bargaining in terms of pricing for cloud storage and stuff would certainly go a long way to help. But there are other areas in which those kinds of economies of scales would also work.
Pam, this is Gil. Can I say one thing real quick?
Sure.
I just want to look back at Jonathan Blythe's question, which I think is absolutely apropos. And I think either this type of legal framework that ensures that we respect the rights of indigenous peoples is so important that it has to be a part of the legal infrastructure upon which this action center is built. And I can see this being a very important topic for one or more future focus groups where we look at how this can happen. And I think the problem now is there's a lot of interest in making these kinds of things happen, and there's not a lot of know-how. And so we've got to figure out how to do this in a way that is responsible. So that's really great. I think we need to add that to definitely add that to our list of consideration about components of what this action center would look like.
Sure.
Thanks a lot, Gil. It's a very important point. And Hillary, I think Shirley was typing a response to you, but we'll go ahead and maybe address this quickly. With regard to Kevin's question, wondering about how approaches at an action center can be downscaled and guide convergence, that is for a small field station site with multiple taxon collections, multiple tissues, multiple observation and genomic data. I think that the view of the action center, to the extent that there was one from the in the NASEM report, is that this would be an enabling center at all scales. And so, there could be, and hopefully would be, some aspects of the center that would allow us to do things that we couldn't do without it. But at the same time, we would hope that there would be opportunities for sharing best practices and helping institutions meet whatever their needs are. So I could certainly imagine that there would be opportunities for enhancing the sorts of data and opportunities that that you have at Archbold, for example.
Pam, this is Shirley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
So the other thing too that I wanted to point out was that I don't think there's like one size fits all, that there may not, there could be an option for more than one physical center. And in fact, we used, I believe the NASEM report used the Marine Biological Lab as one example of how we might be able to, do more outreach and use some of the data, the specimens, in more innovative ways as well. So it wasn't a one size fits all approach or even a single physical action center, but the possibility exists for them at different scales. So I think this is a really excellent point, Hillary.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. Oh, sorry.
I agree. I think that model is a good one, of having a centralized action center, but then having these, satellite action centers that would feed into that main one, who can work in the local communities and can work with those local collections and can sort of, feed some of those best practices and standards and learn from other people's mistakes, as well as provide the sort of advocacy that's needed to rise those collections up and showcase their strengths.
Okay, thanks. Am I frozen again, potentially?
No, we can still hear you.
Oh, okay, good. I got another little label that my internet was going to go. So final question then will be from David Bloom. Can we please begin to use specific language that is explicit, that the processes of data mobilization and publication prior to making data public is included here? These processes are not digitization, and they don't happen magically, despite the mystical powers of the three shiny faces on my screen. It is something that takes time, effort, and skill. In addition, would it not be wise to also stake out some ground on the post-publication side of these processes and get into data use? Totally agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I mean the whole advocacy and attribution side of this data cycle in terms of showcasing how the data is being used and feeding those metrics back to the collection so that they can use that as a method for advocacy is hugely important. I also agree that yes, data mobilization and publication is not digitization. It's a separate process that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. But the hope is that, you know, such an action center could support the kinds of work that IDIG-Bio, GBIF, VertNet, all of these kinds of places are doing in terms of data publication and in terms of metrics and in terms of data cleanup and all of those kinds of things, to provide a sort of, you know, one-stop shop for that kind of stuff to ensure that there isn't duplication of effort all over the world.
Agree.
Okay. All right. And then the last comment that we have was that this was a terrific discussion. Many thanks. And certainly thank you all to our participants for sharing your thoughts and asking such great questions. We'll see you again next week. We'll have a different set of presenters. This will probably help us address some additional questions, and will also likely give us some new and different perspectives as well. So thanks again to Andy and Barbara, and thanks to everybody for your participation. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for facilitating, Pam.
Thank you, Pam.
Sure.
Enjoy Belgium.
Yep. Bye. Yeah, thanks.